How to sew the Birdhouse Doorstop. Available in two beautiful prints, the Bluebell House and the Lavender House. Bring the garden indoors with this pretty little birdhouse doorstop. It is easy to make with beautiful illustrations. Cutting out. Unfold the fabric piece and lay it flat. Now cut around all the pieces. You can see they're all labelled with the labels above them. Cut round them and pin the label to the top of each piece to remind you later when you're assembling. There are lots of optional applique pieces which you can add to your birdhouse later if you want. Quilting the pieces. Take the birdhouse front, back, the inner roofs, the two side pieces and the base and press them on top of your wadding or tack into place if you're using a sew-in wadding. Then cut them out round the edge of the wadding. You can now add any quilting details. I quilted along the lines of the wood, around the swing, around the doors and the shutters. I also quilted along the lines of the green leaves and then along the roof pieces as well. If you want to add any applique details, I've added the name of the Bluebell House here. Do so at this stage. Making the door. Take the door outer and press interfacing onto the wrong side of it. Now take the door lining, remove the labels at this point, and place it right sides facing with the door outer, making sure all the raw edges match up. Now pin it together all the way around the edge. You need to leave a turning gap so you can turn it right sides out. So measure and mark a 1 inch turning gap along one side. Just a little bit up from the bottom edge and make sure it's about 1 inch long. Place pins so you remember to stop and start. Now sew it together all the way around, starting at one side of the turning gap and finishing at the other side. Once this is done, trim off the corners so that you can remove as much bulk as possible and also trim around the curved edge. Again, trim off the corners. Now turn the door right sides out through the turning gap. Do this slowly and carefully, easing it out gradually until the whole door is turned right sides out. Use your fingers to press to ease out all the corners and the curves so that the seam lies neatly on the edge all the way around. Roll it between your fingers. Now turn the edges of the turning gap to the inside so that they meet up with the seams either side of the turning gap, and then top stitch all the way around the edge. This will give it a neater finish. Attaching the door. Take the birdhouse front and place the door centrally over the door opening and pin it into place. Now to create a hinge, you need to sew the door to the birdhouse front. So measure and mark 1/2 inch up from the bottom edge of the left-hand side of the door. Then measure and mark 1.5 inches above this. Now top stitch this into place on top of the already worked stitching just to create a hinge. Now if you want your door to open and close, sew a press fastener to the inside of the door and the birdhouse front. And if you like, you can sew a button on top of the doorknob. Making the handle. Take the handle piece, remove the label and fold it in half with right sides facing lengthways so that the long raw edges match up, and then pin it together all the way along, making sure that all the raw edges match up as you pin. Now sew it together along this long edge. Press the seam open and flat, then turn the handle right sides out. I sewed together across the end because I'm going to use a turning tube to turn it right sides out. This is the quickest and easiest way to do it. Place the tube inside the handle, then take the stick, the blunt end of it, and push the handle up inside the tube to easily turn it right sides out. Once this is done, remove those tacking stitches from the short end. These are just put in to make turning the tube easier. So use a longer stitch when you're doing these. Now press it so that the seam lies right on the edge. Once this is done, top stitch down both sides to neaten. And your handle is finished. Put this to one side for now. Assembling the birdhouse. To help with sewing the birdhouse pieces together accurately, measure and mark a line 1/4 inch from on the wrong side of the top pointed edges of the birdhouse front and back. I've used a ruler for doing this, but you could just mark using a tape measure and join the lines up. These will be your sewing lines when assembling the birdhouse. So mark the birdhouse front and mark the top edges of the birdhouse back. Then the birdhouse inner roof, mark 1/4 inch all the way around the inside of this, of both inner roof pieces. And then the top edge of the birdhouse side and the top edge of the other birdhouse side. Once all these pieces are marked, you can make the birdhouse body. So take one birdhouse side and pin it together, matching bottom raw edges and the right side edges. So pin it together from the top to the bottom. The points of these will all match up. Now you need to start stitching 1/4 inch down from the top edge. Mark this and then mark 1/4 inch up from the bottom raw edge and stitch it together between these points. Leaving those 1/4 inches unstitched at either end will make assembly easier later. Once this is stitched, open it out and take the birdhouse back. Place this right sides facing with the other side of the side piece and pin it together, matching the bottom raw edge and again matching the top raw edge. I find it easier to stitch it in place with the side piece on the top, just because you can see where to stop and start finishing a little bit easier. Again, measure and mark 1/4 inch up from the bottom and 1/4 inch down from the top, and sew it together between these 2 points. Once this is done, open it out, take the other side piece, place this right sides facing with the other side of the birdhouse back, match the bottom raw edge and pin it together. Then match the top raw edge and pin it together. And pin it together in the centre. Again, measure and mark 1/4 inch up from the bottom and measure 1/4 inch down from the top. Now sew together between these 2 points. Once this is done, you can join the whole thing together. So place the other side of the birdhouse front with the unstitched side of the other birdhouse side piece, pin it together matching the bottom raw edge and pin it together matching the top raw edge. And pin it in the centre. make sure the raw edges are matching. Again, measure and mark 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom, and you've already got the mark for the top. Sew it together between these 2 points. You've now got your whole birdhouse body joined together. So let's put the handle into the inner roof first. Fold it in half, matching those short raw ends, and pin it together. Now take one birdhouse inner roof piece, fold it in half to find the centre. You can see on this that the vertical lines of my top stitching are running down from the top piece. Now place the handle so it's in the centre, but the end of the handle needs to extend 1/2 inch above the raw edge. This will make it more secure and stronger when you're carrying your doorstop later. So pin it into place, making sure that it's in the centre. And pin it into place a little bit of the way down as well. Take the other birdhouse inner roof piece and place it right sides down on top, and pin it to the other birdhouse inner roof piece. Take that pin out that you secured with the handle, making sure it stays in place, and pin all the layers together. Now stitch it together, starting and finishing 1/4 inch from the top and 1/4 inch from the bottom again. You've now got your handle neatly secured. So to attach the inner roof, take the top point and push a pin through where you marked earlier, and then push that through 1/4 inch down from the top, which is the beginning of your seam. Matching these points will make sure the inner roof fits perfectly when you sew it all together. So keep that pin in place and then replace it with a vertical pin. Now everything is held together and you know it's in the right place. So open up the seam between the birdhouse front and one of the side pieces and place it so the seam allowance of the side piece matches up with the raw edge of the inner roof. Pin it so that seam stays open. And you can see that the 1/4 inch lines you marked on the birdhouse front are now matching with the 1/4 inch seam lines you marked on the inner roof. Now sew it together, starting 1/4 inch from the edge and finishing 1/4 inch from the edge, so that you're starting and finishing on the ends of the seams. Once this is sewn together, take it out from under your machine. Open up the side seam that's between the birdhouse back and the side piece. And again, pin this into place, making sure that the folded over seam allowance edge matches up with the raw edge of the inner roof. And the top of that seam will mark up with the corner marked point on the birdhouse inner roof. Pushing a pin through helps to get this exact. I'll pin it together along the top, making sure that those marked seam allowances match up, and sew it together, starting and finishing 1/4 inch in from each edge. Once you've sewn that into place, take it out from under your machine and pin the next side of the inner roof and the birdhouse back into place. Again, push a pin through the marked point and into the seam. Now continue sewing it in place, the inner roof all the way round, matching and marking those points all the way round, and you'll have a neatly inserted inner roof. If any of your seams don't match up perfectly, don't worry, they'll be covered by the roof later. Now take the birdhouse base and, keeping everything wrong sides together, pin one side of the birdhouse base to the birdhouse front. Again, when you open out the seam, the edge of the raw edge of the seam allowance needs to match up with the raw edge of the roof. But because you started and finished stitching 1/4 inch up from the side and the front and back pieces, these will be the points where you can pivot your stitching and will help you to get your base to lay flatter. So pin it into place either end and then pin it across the centre. Now stitch it into place, starting and finishing 1/4 inch in from each edge, which is the end of your seam. Now pin the other side to the bottom of the base, again matching up the raw edges of the base with the opened out seam allowance. Adjust it slightly so that everything matches up and that you're starting and finishing 1/4 inch from each end. And pin it together in the centre. Now you need to leave a turning gap in the base of the doorstop because this is where you're going to fill it. So if you mark a 3-inch turning gap so that it's central, this means it will be about 1 inch from each end. Mark this in place using vertical pins and then sew from the seam to one side of the turning gap, the other side of the turning gap to the seam. Now sew the rest of the base into place all the way around, again remembering to match those corner points and starting and finishing 1/4 inch in from each side. Then your base will lie neatly. Now turn the birdhouse right sides out through the turning gap. Do this gently so that you don't put any strain on the turning gap seams, but it's just about big enough to turn it right sides out. Once it's all turned right sides out, push out all those corners just with your fingers so that they're lying neatly on the edges. And also push out all the corners of the inner roof and the side and the birdhouse front and back pieces too. Now because you're going to be filling through this turning gap, to make it easier to hold it under whilst you're filling it, tack it in place. So fold the edges of the turning gap under by 1/4 inch. And taking some spare sewing thread, I used a contrasting colour so I could see it easily, just fold them under by 1/4 inch and tack them into place all the way round. This stops any edges from fraying and does make the filling of the birdhouse a little easier. A long running stitch is ideal for tacking at this stage, and it can easily be removed when you finish the birdhouse. To finish this off, just work a few stitches on top of each other to stop the tacking coming undone. Adding the perch. Take the 2 perch pieces and measure and mark so that you fold the short straight end over by 1/4 inch to the wrong side. And just finger press this into place. Repeat this with the other perch piece so that you turn that short straight end under by 1/4 inch to the wrong side. I measured 1/2 inch, then turned over to meet up with this mark, and then you get 1/4 inch. Once this is done, place the 2 perch pieces right sides facing, making sure those turned under ends stay turned under, and pin it into place all the way round. Now sew it together all the way around, but leaving that short straight turned under edge open. Now turn the perch right sides out. You can do this by just pushing the end in, or if you use a turning tube, place the tube inside and just push it through. Or you can just use a stick to do this. Push out all the edges so that the seam lies neatly on the edge. Now you need to stuff it. Use small amounts of soft toy filling so that it is stuffed very firmly. Use little bits one at a time so that you get the stuffing right into the end, because this perch needs to be very solid. And then it will stand out nicely from the front of your birdhouse. So stuff it right up to the end. As you can see, I just use small amounts and use something like a small stick to push it inside. And fill it right up to the top of that turned under edge. When you get to the end, just use even smaller amounts. You don't want the filling to stick out from the end, but the perch does need to be very tightly and fully stuffed. Now, take your assembled birdhouse, and I've put my perch just above the door, centrally. You can measure and mark this centre point if you like. So open out the short end so it forms a circle, and then I used pins pushed vertically in to hold it in place. Now put your hand inside the turning gap and hold the end of the perch with your thumb, and then you can pin it into place. Make sure that the opening stays open so it's like a circle. If you push vertical pins in all the way through, that will hold it in place. Now, take a needle and some sewing thread and slip stitch the perch into place. You do this by working small stitches through the edge of the perch and into the birdhouse front. Work a couple of small stitches one on top of each other just to secure the thread. And then, working all the way round, work stitches into the birdhouse front and then into the perch. Work slowly and carefully all the way round. The pins will hold it in place, and you can remove these as you go. The easiest way to do this is to work the stitches all the way round, spaced as far apart as you like, and then work round it again to stitch in between those. That will hold it securely. I stitched round it about 3 times just to make sure it was all secure and that I filled in all the gaps so that none of the wadding was coming out, the soft toy filling was coming out, and then the perch was securely attached. Snip off the thread to finish. And you can see your perch is nicely attached. Filling the birdhouse. To make a filling bag, cut a piece of fabric that's listed in the ingredients of your instructions. Now fold it in half widthways and pin it together across the top edge so that you've got a fold on the right hand side and raw edges on the left, and then pin it together along the bottom edge. Sew it together along the top and then sew it together along the bottom. Turn this right sides out and fill with your chosen filling. This could be rice, lentils. I've used children's play sand, as I think that gives a really nice weighted finish, or you can use special weighted filling pellets. Now pin it together across the edge, having turned those edges under by 1/4 of an inch, just so that you don't have any raw edges, and stitch it together across the top. That secures the filling inside. Now, using soft toy filling and using small pieces at a time, push it through the turning gap so that you're filling the roof section. Fill it all the way to the top. Make sure it's nicely filled but not overstuffed. The wadding will help to keep its shape. Now take your filling bag, push all the filling to one end and push the empty part into the doorstop. Now what you need to do now is a bit like an egg timer, is you're pouring the sand through into the empty part, which is why you only half fill the bag. If you ease it gradually and keep emptying it through, you will find all the filling and the sand goes inside, or whatever your weighted filling is. Give it a shake so that weighted filling bag sits at the bottom. You'll need to add some more filling now above the filling bag and below the filling that you've already put in. This will just push some into the corners of the birdhouse. This will just help to keep its shape. Remember, make sure it's stuffed well, but not overstuffed. Now take the edges of the filling gap that you tacked under earlier and pin them together. Now you can slip stitch the turning gap closed. Do this by hand using a matching thread. Work a few stitches on top of each other just to secure the end of the thread, and then work a small stitch into one side of the turning gap and out from the other side. I find it easier to space these stitches apart in the first go just to hold the turning gap together, and then stitch back across it to fill in any of the gaps. This keeps that turning gap nicely closed and neat, and just work small stitches so that you can't really see them very easily. Now you can see I've worked back across it twice to make it extra secure. So again, work a few small stitches on top of each other and then snip the end. Now remove those tacking stitches that you put in earlier, because everything is held nicely and securely in place. Making the roof. Take one birdhouse main roof outer and one piece of birdhouse main roof lining and place them right sides facing. Now place these centrally on top of one of the pieces of roof wadding that you cut earlier as detailed in the instructions that come with your kit. Pin the two pieces of fabric to the wadding all the way round. You don't need to press the wadding into place. If you've used fusible wadding, this will be sewn because you're sewing the layers together. You need to leave a turning gap in one side. So mark the centre. I've left a 2.5 inch gap, so mark the centre point and then mark 1.25 inches either side of this using vertical pins so that you don't forget to leave the gap. Now stitch it together all the way round, starting one side of the turning gap and finishing on the other side. Once this is done, trim the wadding so that it is level with the raw edges of the fabric. It's much easier to stitch fabric centrally onto a piece of wadding and then cut it, rather than the wadding being exactly the same size. So once you've trimmed this all the way round, trim off the corners to reduce bulk in this area when turning it right sides out. Now press the seam open by folding the top layer of fabric over to the wrong side and pressing it. Again, this will help the seams to lie right on the edge of your finished roof. So open it out with your fingers, and you can either finger press it or use an iron to press. Also do this on the side where the turning gap is, because this will help to hold the turning gap to the inside, and then turn it over and just turn the other side of the turning gap to the inside. Now you can turn your roof right sides out. Once you've got it right sides out, so you've got the inner and the outer roof, one on each side, and the wadding is in the middle, push out all of those corners with your fingers. So that it's nice and neat and you've got a nice shaped piece with all the seams laying right on the edges. So press it all the way round, making sure the corners are right in the edges. Once this is done, top stitch all the way round to hold the turning gap closed, and I worked lines of top stitching along the slate lines of the roof as well to add some detail. Attaching the roof. Take one of the roof pieces you've already made and measure and mark with a pin the centre of the top. You can see what the top edge is by the way that the slates lay. Now take your assembled birdhouse and take one of the roofs and place this centrally across the top so that the pin is in the centre of where the handle is, and then just push a pin through the roof and into the birdhouse. Make sure the top edge of the roof matches up exactly with the seam at the top of the inner roof. Now turn it over to the other side, take the other main roof piece and match them up so that the edges meet, so the top seamed edges and the outer edges meet, and pin these together. Pin the other side together in the same way, making sure the side and the top edges meet up. And then pin either side of the handle. At this stage, you are just going to be pinning and sewing the main roof pieces together. You're not actually going to be sewing it to the birdhouse. So take a length of matching thread and sew the main roof pieces together across that top edge. So start off by securing the thread by working a few small stitches on top of each other. This just secures the thread in place before you begin and stops it coming undone. You can take out the pins as you go along. Once you're happy the thread is secured, just work an over sewing stitch through the top of both main roof pieces. You're not actually attaching it to the birdhouse at this point. This is just to attach the roof, but you need to do it whilst it's on the birdhouse so it's in the right place. When you reach one side of the handle, work a few stitches on top of each other just to secure the end of that seam and cut off the thread. Now turn it around and stitch it together in the same way, starting at one side and finishing on the one side of the handle. Now lay the birdhouse on its side, smooth the roof down so you know it's laying flat, and then push pins through so that the pins are going into the inner roof section of the birdhouse, not the sides, just above that inner roof. Turn it over to the other side and again smooth it down so that you know it's flat and push pins in. I put them sort of through the centre of the second row of slates. That's just enough to hold it in place. And then when you get to the birdhouse front and back at the gable ends of the roof, again, push pins through the roof and into the birdhouse just to hold the roof into position before you sew it in place. Push pins through as many as you want until you're happy that it's all central. You can now start sewing it in place. So again, attach a length of sewing thread in one corner of the birdhouse side. Now work stitches so that you've got a long stitch going through the side and then another stitch through the roof so that all you've got on the right side are small stitches. Make sure though that these stitches don't come through to the outside of the roof, that they're only worked into the inside of the roof. This means that none of your stitches will be seen. It also makes it a bit easier because it doesn't have to be too neat because all the stitches will be hidden underneath the roof. So stitch the roof into place all the way along one side. This is quite easy to do because you can work quite long stitches. What I tended to do after I'd worked 3 or 4 stitches, I worked a few over sewing stitches to secure. Now repeat this all the way along the gable ends and along the other side and across the gable ends of the front. Once this is done, your roof is now neatly secured all the way around the top of your birdhouse. And your birdhouse doorstop is now finished.